Hello and welcome to part 2 of my history series on myalgic encephalomyelitis. If you haven't seen the first part, I will put a link to it and I recommend you go see that first because we start off right from the end of that first video. If you have seen the first video, I hope it was helpful and I hope that's why you're back here for part 2. In part 2, I'm going to cover the 20th and 21st century experience of ME CFS, and I also discuss the PACE trials, the NICE guidelines, and I go a little bit into long COVID. Again, I apologize for my breathlessness and slurring of a lot of the words throughout it. I hope it is still intelligible. And without further ado, welcome to part 2. Now we get into the 20th century. So throughout 1930 to 1960, most of the early to mid 20th century, ME was believed to be a kind of unusual presentation of polio, which was referred to as atypical polio or poliomyelitis, which is the long form of the word. It was first labeled as atypical polio by Alexander Gilliam, who I could not find a single source on the internet, so that was very unusual. Now, the 1934 outbreak at the LA County Hospital infected the majority of all of their nurses and doctors. The symptoms of this atypical polio included rapid muscle weakness, vasomotor instability, clonic twitches and cramps, ataxia, severe pain, usually aggravated by exercise, so also known as post-exertional malaise now, neck and back stiffness, menstrual disturbance, and dominant sensory involvement. So we will add these symptoms to the board. Vasomotor instability refers to rapid hot and cold flushes, which can also be put under autonomic symptoms as well as excessive sweating, racing heart, and a couple of others on the list. Now, in 1936, there was an outbreak at a Wisconsin convent. With the Wisconsin convent, that's a tricky one to say, with the Wisconsin convent outbreak, it was referred to as encephalitis. So we have a new name on the list. Now, in 1937 and 1973, there were 2 outbreaks in Switzerland, which were diagnosed as abortive poliomyelitis. Abortive poliomyelitis was basically polio that doesn't have any lasting effects, so no paralysis of the limbs or permanent disability. Now we add Adelaide in 1949. 800 people in Adelaide became ill between 1949 and 1951 and were diagnosed with an illness resembling poliomyelitis. There were 2 small outbreaks in America in the 1950s. These 2 small outbreaks in America were referred to as epidemic neuroasthenia, or also referred to as Icelandic disease in this time as well. There were several outbreaks of polio-resembling illnesses in Britain in the 1950s before the penning of ME in 1956. Now, 1956 was when myalgic encephalomyelitis was first penned, and at that time was when they looked back at all of these past diagnoses and put them all under the banner of ME. Now, ME was also linked to similar symptoms experienced in the general public, and the epidemic form of ME was noticed as an outlier. So while I am talking greatly about the epidemic cases, because that's where the most research lies, there was a vast majority more cases of ME that were just sporadic within the community. Now, in the 1950s, they also began doing pathological investigations into this mystery illness. So there were pathological findings in monkeys and in rare human casualties of the disease that indicated inflammation of the brain, spinal cord, and particularly affecting the nerve roots. As we enter the 1960s and 70s, this is when the most documented mass hysteria was. ME was now relabeled as mass hysteria, as they always like to do. During this time, while a lot of cases were considered to be chronic brucellosis, which was another infectious disease, the majority of the cases were considered to be psychiatric in nature. This is when we move depression from the symptoms board to the causes side. This was now an appropriate diagnosis for all of these symptoms. You're just depressed, man. So these epidemic cases of ME were considered to be mass hysteria and were championed by George Millerbeard, this bad boy here, and a psychiatrist called Dr. Colin Peter McEvedy. However, even during this time when it was largely considered mass hysteria. It was heavily disputed by researchers, physicians, and especially by physicians who had then become ill with mass hysteria or ME. In 1978, UK's Royal Society of Medicine concluded that epidemic myalgic encephalomyelitis was a distinct disease with a clear organic base. However, unfortunately, despite this research having been done 50 years ago, even today some cases are still considered to be psychiatrically caused, or if not caused, very heavily influenced by having psychiatric disorders. Now, in the mid-80s, after the Incline Village, Nevada outbreak, it was designated as chronic Epstein-Barr virus. I'm going to start a new diagnosis board here. It was believed to be chronic Epstein-Barr virus. However, they then did tests and there was no Epstein-Barr to be found. So they then labeled it chronic fatigue syndrome. There was also a magazine that published at this time that referred to it as Raggedy Ann syndrome, which doesn't have much historical context, as this seemed it was only used a couple of times and there wasn't any research that went directly into Raggedy Ann syndrome. However, I just think it's kind of a cool name for it, so I'm putting it up here. So it was 1988 that marked the first working case definition of chronic fatigue syndrome. This is a definition that still exists today and is still a diagnosis that is able to be given. There was some 1990 research that believed that this chronic fatigue, or ME, could be linked to human T lymphotropic virus, which I tried to do research on, and the majority of the information out there is very scientific and medical, and I could not understand a lot of it, but it seems to be an illness of the lymphatic system, which can cause cancer. The CDC initially ignored these findings, but then several years later refuted the hypothesis, so that's no longer a thing. Now we are entering into the 21st century. I took a break, made some food, watched some ghost hunting videos to get the adrenaline pumping so I can finish this. 21st century. So there have been a handful of studies done on ME in the 21st century, which I'm not going to go into because I just feel like that starts on the path away from history and more into the medical and scientific explanations. In the 21st century, the most important thing that's happened is that post-exertional malaise has been recognized as the hallmark symptom of ME. Post-exertional malaise. Important, this one. The history of ME starts to get a bit political at this point. We have the PACE trials starting in 2005. The PACE trials stood for Pacing, Graded Activity and Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, a randomized evaluation. This research trialed adaptive pacing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and graded exercise therapy to see which one is the most effective for ME. So this brings us to PACE trials 2005. So the PACE trials looked at adaptive pacing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and graded exercise therapy. The trials concluded that cognitive behavioral therapy and graded exercise therapy are the most effective treatments for myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. There were large concerns about this for many reasons, regarding the methodology and their refusal to release full data. After 5 years of campaigning, the full results were released for independent study. Over 40 scientists wrote an open letter to Lancet, the same medical journal we mentioned before that has previously published some of the more historical ME research. This letter raised serious concerns and asked for an independent analysis of the results. Now, the PACE trials cost somewhere between 5 to 8 million. Majority of sources I found say 5 million, but I did see a couple that said 8 million. This is the most expensive ME research that has been done to this day, 2022. The study collected results from 2005 to 2010. The principal researchers were Dr. Michael Sharp, Dr. Trudy Chulda, and Dr. Peter White. I believe it is important to note that all three of these researchers have their background in psychology or psychiatry. The PACE trials were highly influential on the clinical guidelines for treating ME CFS. We will be mentioning the NICE guidelines, which are the UK guidelines, however they are very influential globally. So why was it refuted? Because I can't just very well say that, oh, this trial said something, but it was refuted. That means nothing. I very clearly want to go into why it was refuted, as I do believe the results of the PACE trial were very damaging to chronic fatigue syndrome. I have had personal experiences with graded exercise therapy and heard many stories from others that show it significantly worsens chronic fatigue syndrome, not improves it, as the study showed. So PACE claimed that patients receiving graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy had a 22% recovery versus 8% who received adaptive pacing therapy. Halfway through the study, the main outcome and the recovery analysis were changed. They claimed it was before any outcome data had been received. However, 42 scientists stated that, and I'm going to read this verbatim, of particular concern in an unblinded trial like PACE, in which outcome trends are often apparent long before outcome data are seen, the investigators provided no sensitivity analysis to assess the impact of the changes and have refused requests to provide the results per the methods outlined in their protocol. Now, this is where I'm going to introduce Dr. David Tuller. Dr. David Tuller was essential in campaigning and researching and influencing for the PACE trials to be appropriately assessed externally. Dr. David Tuller does a lot of work in ME, CFS and other unexplained illnesses. He is a senior fellow in public health in journalism at the Center of Global Health and the School of Public Health and the University of California. He covered the PACE trials for the New York Times, which is what led him to do far more research into it and then end up campaigning for the further analysis. He's also raised significant funds for other ME/CFS research. The authors of the PACE trial introduced normal ranges for fatigue and physical function. They introduced these ranges after the information was already analysed. They have been criticised for the ranges being so low that patients could worsen from the beginning of the trial and still be considered in a normal range. All requests for the main outcome and recovery results set before the trial started have been refused, and all underlying data has also been refused to be shared. It is also criticised the subjective analyses were heavily influenced. The CBT and GET trial patients were given far more positive and aspirational encouragement, and this likely impacted the self-assessment. The researchers of the PACE trial, these three bad boys, also failed to adequately inform patients of the trial that they had financial and consulting relationship with disability insurance companies, i.e. they stood to have financial losses or financial gains depending on the outcome. Graded exercise therapy and CBT being the ones that provided them with further financial income. A later survey by the ME Association in 2012 showed that 74% of patients who tried graded exercise therapy worsened. For succinct but comprehensive information regarding the PACE trials, I strongly recommend Trial by Error, the troubling case of the PACE chronic fatigue syndrome study, which was written by Dr. David Tuller, and you can find it by Googling that. Now, the 2007 NICE guidelines, they are the clinical guidelines saying, hey doctors, if the patient has this illness, this is the treatment they should receive. Incorporated graded exercise therapy to be recovered. The 2022 was a review of this study and has most notably removed graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy as treatments for chronic fatigue syndrome. This brings us to long COVID. Long COVID is the most recent epidemic that is most likely going to fall under the myalgic encephalomyelitis umbrella. Research is ongoing and it has not been proven that long COVID is ME/CFS. However, a large majority of the research is being done by myalgic encephalomyelitis research facilities, and a lot of charities and organizations have taken long COVID under its wing. The main reason it is being presumed by a lot of people to be ME is that it follows almost exactly the same patterns as all of these previous diagnoses have had. Now, what is ME/CFS today? So today you can be diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. It is mostly a diagnosis by elimination, meaning they've tested for everything else and it's not everything else, so it has to be that. However, the most prominent symptom to have that you must have in order to be classified as having chronic fatigue syndrome is the post-exertional malaise, so extreme illness and fatigue after physical exertion. Now, I'm hoping that all of this information has been clear and that you find it helpful. Thank you. Bye. Thank you for watching part 2 of my history of myalgic encephalomyelitis. I hope part 1 and 2 were really informative. I'm hoping to do more of these history videos on different chronic illnesses, so subscribe if you want to see more.